Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is a round 2 game from the 2013 FIDE Grand Prix held in Thessaloniki, Greece. It's between Fabiano Caruana and Vassily Ivanchuk. We have Caruana on the white end opening with e4, Ivanchuk playing e5. The game heads for a Ruy Lopez with d6, a Modern Steinitz. The knight will be unpinned in short order. And now the typical building of the center that is often the case in the Ruy Lopez with c3 and d4. And in response in this game, we have a fianchetto set up by black. After now castles and bishop g7, h3, aimed at guarding the g4 square. And this is important, I believe, an important move to play prior to bishop to e3. For if bishop e3 is played right away, knight f6 attacks the pawn and looks to harass the bishop. There's not a way to defend both e4 and g4. So it is first h3, h6. How to classify this particular move. If you'd like to, pause the video, see if you can come up with some reasons as to why h6 is played in this position, and I'll just go ahead and share my thoughts. Okay, I feel h6 is played because, well, it's a useful move, and it's a waiting move. Useful because it keeps out the knight and the bishop from g5. Not that that would turn into anything great right away. You could also view it maybe more long-term, something like g5 and g4 as a possibility that might be a bit far-fetched. That's another thing you could be looking into. Additionally, once castled, the king likes to have that additional square, h7, available. And it's a waiting move in the sense of what exactly? What is black waiting for? Black is waiting to learn a little bit more about how white will complete development, or what white will maybe do in the center. Will white play d5 and will we have a closed center, or will there be a capture and the position will open up? Will there be bishop e3, knight d2, rook f1, the knight going for maybe this little journey to e3 or g3? There's a lot of, in short, there's a lot of unanswered questions that black hopes to figure out the answers to by making a useful move and a waiting move. And depending on what white does, maybe this knight on g8 will play to e7 or f6. So by playing h6, useful move, waiting move, and you retain this knight's flexibility on g8. Bishop e3 was decided on. Black goes forward with connecting the knights, and keep in mind f5 is now always available to maybe strike at e4. In this other detail that I was talking about with g5, maybe that's a possibility as well. g5, knight g6 to f4 possibilities. Anyhow, white follows suit, connecting knights. Black castles. The tension is resolved in the center. And now we have bishop to c5. So bishops tend to function well on adjacent diagonals, and this knight is in a pin. So those are two reasons to maybe make a move such as bishop to c5. But I don't think that those are the reasons why the bishop played to c5. As good as it looks, having bishops on adjacent diagonals and this knight in a pin. The pin issue is resolved right away. And soon enough, we're going to be having something like b6 and the bishop is kicked back. Okay, the bishops are still maintained on these two adjacent diagonals. I think the main reason for this bishop's placement is to provoke weaknesses. White wants to see this b6 move because then there's something that maybe white can strive for. Maybe there's a way to then exploit the weaknesses that are left behind as a result of kicking a piece out of your own position. It's usually not a good thing to have an opposing piece in your territory, and currently that's the situation that black finds himself in. Having a bishop, a white bishop on that c5 square in black's position. In the game, we will see b6, and as a direct result of that, c6 and a6 are weakened. White will be able to put pressure on that, and the implications of such are that it could translate into white maybe gaining control over the only open file, and as it stands right now, that only open file is the d file. And on top of that, there is one other detail, and we will see that soon enough. So first things first, we have rook to e1 This I classify as a move similar to this h6 move in the sense that I think it's a waiting move. Bolstering the center, maybe making way for knight f1, although knight c4 looks appealing. And not declaring the queen's intention, that's another detail. Maybe a move like queen to e2 seems natural enough, but maybe there's a reason to keep the queen on this diagonal, seeing how the likelihood of light square bishops being exchanged are pretty good. There's just one piece separating them, right? One piece caught in between those light square bishops. And when those pieces are exchanged, keep in mind this is considered white's bad bishop on a4, and this would be considered black's good bishop. Having that exchange would be beneficial to the white player. So rook to e1 I view as a little bit of a waiting move. Now we have b6 being played, the bishop drops back, and now knight to a7. Light square bishops come off. Knight c4, white welcomes the queen exchange, that is avoided. There's quite a bit of time that was invested on that, by the way, by Ivanchuk, about 35 minutes. The queen exchanged is avoided, looking to maybe gain a tempo on the queen. Knight e3 repositions, eyes this d5 square, and now we have knight b5. The bishop gives itself up for the knight. This is something Caruana was content with at this point. He had to have known after knight e3, what do you do after knight to b5? There is only one good response, as otherwise your queenside structure is going to get crushed. So bishop takes knight, rook recaptures, and now what white could be doing, what sort of strategy or plan white could look to implement from such a position is what exactly? Well, keep in mind that since we had that light square bishop exchange, what now remains is a bad bishop because he is obstructed in some way by a pawn that is fixed on a dark square. So what this means is that maybe the knight could be taking up residence on d5 one day and never be chased away if this pawn is no longer around on the c file. If a pair of knights are coming off the board, we could enter strategic positions that are good for white, a good knight, the typical good knight versus bad bishop. In short, white's plan here is to never allow this dark square bishop to exchange itself off for either of these knights. There's one other detail that we are going to see soon that is quite interesting, how this all ends up tying together, this idea of b6 weakening these light squares and then white putting pressure on them. We end up seeing a very interesting sacrifice. c6 is made use of right away. Rook c8, getting out an open file, king h7. White now looks to double on the d file. The queen exchange is being offered. Queen b7, and after knight d6, you could capture this pawn, but what sort of exchange is this? Pawn for pawn, which one was more significant? The central one was more significant. If there's no e4 pawn, that means black could be pushing forward in the center with e4. This knight has to find a new home. This bishop comes to life. No way. So much more, this pawn on e4 much more valuable than the a6 pawn. And it seems like we might be at a point where we would be repeating the position. Potential for like repetition of position, queen c6, queen b7, this knight jumping back and forth on e8 and d6, but no. We have something else. Rook takes knight. Why is this even possible? What do we have as a follow-up? Well, actually there's only one recapture. C takes d. Queen takes, you end up hanging the rook on c8. So only now do we have queen takes a. And when we just go by, when we look at the numerical, okay, just the point value thing here, white is down a pawn, okay? They've given up the exchange, they have a pawn for it, but there's so much more to it because, again, we have a very bad bishop, and this d5 square that I was speaking of earlier, it's a wonderful home for the knight. He cannot be kicked from that square. He is now in black's territory, and he certainly compensates for the material deficit. And we see soon enough a great lockdown on the queen side, and it will happen in the following form. Starting first, notice how those last two moves, by the way, the rooks were being threatened, so they get out of the way. a4 is the move. In the ideal setup for white, the thing to strive for is to not allow black to really make any more pawn exchanges, at least on the queen side. If they make pawn advances on the king side, well, their king is still a bit more vulnerable. And so with the queen still on, you have to be a bit delicate on the black end to be making this type of pawn advance. So first order of business on the queen side, at least, is to establish pawns on a4, c4, and b3. And we see that take shape soon enough. It is first f5. The knight is repositioning, and white would love to see pawn takes. The knight would be there to recapture soon. I think actually something like c4 would be important first. There could be rook a5 stuff to pick off the knight. But the knight is there in a position to eventually recapture on e4. The bishop gets to a better square, looking to get rid of itself. Black wants to get rid of at least one of the knights because he is a liability for as long as he's on the board. Queen to e8, sharp move. If the queen is taken, the bishop is taken, and then the queen is recaptured. So that's not going to happen. Nice little trick. Offering a queen exchange. Bishop backs up. And now c4. Keep in mind the queen is still there to watch over a4. Another offer of the queen exchange. That is avoided for right now. This queen is in a really good spot on c6. Black looks to get rid of the queen, and now we have this great lockdown on the queen side. These three pawns on the A, B, and C file, in conjunction with the knight on d5, dominate both rooks. They can't do anything. And on top of that, the knight from d5 restricts the rook to having to babysit the pawn on b6. White is clearly better. Now we have the queens coming off. And in this endgame, well, at the cost of what exactly? That pawn ends up dropping. So I guess black was reasoning, is there really a move to even be making? This rook can't go too far. This rook can't move because of the pressure on the rook on b7. And there's two pieces hitting at b6. And maybe if black doesn't get the queens off at this position, or if black doesn't exchange queens soon, maybe white could now transition. Maybe there's a way to kind of sneak around in this way and put pressure on this white structure and attack the king. Two knights and a queen and these rooks that are really, really struggling to do something constructive. And again, this bishop has no life whatsoever. So at the cost of a pawn, okay, so the queens come off at the cost of a pawn, and now these two are passed. The plan from here will be to do what exactly? Well, first, this knight was attacked, so let's get rid of the bishop. The bishop, that was really bad, but keep in mind there was some pressure. If we did have instead the knight play to this d5 square, I think we could be having this bishop finally doing something constructive, putting pressure on a knight, and if he goes, then there's going to be b3 falling. Can't allow that. So that's why we're having, I was talking quite a bit about this bishop. Don't let him exchange himself off for your knight, but this is a more concrete variation. If you don't, you have to be careful about bishop g5 stuff, undermining essentially this white pawn structure. You do not want this to be, you don't want black to disrupt this formation of a4, b3, c4. So it is knight c8. Knight takes bishop, and now the rook's ideal placement will be on d3, where it puts pressure on d6 and watches over the base point b3. Both kings now get closer to the center. There's now a couple pieces putting pressure on b3. There is enough defense for it. And now king to f6. One thing I was wondering is, what about captures here? If we did have captures on e3, we wouldn't have a knight recapture because b3 falls and then these two are split. Black would probably be close to being better, or at least equal. So you're not, black doesn't want to, or excuse me, white doesn't want to allow black to capture on b3. So we wouldn't have an immediate recapture on e4. Something like rook to c3, and maybe the king coming up to recapture would be there. So anyhow, we don't see that exchange. And one other thing I thought about was, why not f3? So in case there is a capture, recapture. The reason I'm seeing why white was hesitant to play this f3 move is because of a potential king invasion where he puts pressure on g2. We actually see that take shape in the game. And it's interesting to note the point at which Caruana ends up running forward with this f3 advance. We will see that soon, but first the kings get more central. And After h5, we have f3. Only after this king has played a bit more closer to the center with king to e6 do we have this f3 move. I think if he was on f6, white would maybe be a bit more reluctant to make this advance because the king would be that much closer towards heading towards the g2 point, the base point for white. So it is f3 here, and the plan for white is to get these pawns rolling. So how do you make that happen? Well, black goes in this direction, and now white bumps up their king, rook a6, rook d5, and now this is happening, a5, and I don't think that there's a great way to stop it. If something like this, I think a5 is still available. If there's a capture, you get this one, and then you still have these two connected pawns and a very, very active rook and very active king. So it's a tough road ahead for black. In fact, as soon as a5 is in successfully, these pawns get rolling, and they roll fast. So it's rook d5. The king goes on his little journey towards the b pawn, or excuse me, the g pawn. The a and b pawns get rolling for white. And now this knight played here to watch over a5, permits b5 with tempo. Rook grabs the pawn, a6 with tempo. The knight jumps in, b6. This is just too much for black. After e3, white throws in a check and black resigns. There's nothing good to do about this advancement of b6. Black ends up having to give up a rook for a pawn, or maybe even both rooks at this point. The king is not long off from helping out. This rook could maybe even get behind and grab this pawn. This is completely busted for black in this position after rook to f6. There's no stopping these guys from advancing, and black having to give up material. So a very interesting game. This idea of first probing for weaknesses early on with that bishop to c5 move and exploiting the light square weaknesses on a6 and c6, and showing that you could not only enter, let's say, positions where you have, let's say, a good knight versus a bad bishop, but notice that if your opponent does have a bad bishop, how that could maybe translate into potential exchange sacrifices. And I think that we saw that highlighted in a great way in this game. So anyhow, that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.